Welcome back. A great next panel coming up, which is called Global Incident Response, Managing Incidents Impacting Global Enterprises, which is a perfect fit for this conference. So let me start by introducing our moderator. Our moderator today is Spencer Lynch, who is the Managing Director for Stroz Friedberg's London office. Spencer and his team have led and performed preservation and analysis of thousands of digital devices in data breach investigations. He's been accepted as an expert witness in digital forensics by courts in the United States and the High Court in London. Welcome, Spencer.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Keily Blair. She's a partner at Orrick, where she heads the Cyber Privacy and Data Innovation Group in London. Keily has very broad experience defending investigations by the ICO, who we just heard from, as well as the Irish DPC, who we'll hear from later today, and many other international agencies. She previously led the contentious data privacy, law, and strategy practice at PwC. Welcome, Keily.
Hey, Bruce. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here today.
Delighted to also now welcome Stuart Davis of CrowdStrike. Stuart is CrowdStrike's Director of Incident Response and Proactive Services for Europe and the Middle East. Stuart and his team deal with the most sophisticated and impacting cyber breaches every day. He's based out of Dublin, Ireland. Welcome, Stuart.
Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate you having me today.
Finally, I'm pleased to welcome Erez Liebermann. He is now a partner at Linklaters, a very skilled and experienced data privacy lawyer. He spent 10 years as a federal prosecutor in the United States. He then served as chief counsel for cyber and privacy for Prudential Financial, which is when I first met Erez. At that time, he was leading its global team of lawyers on cyber and privacy matters. He is based in New York in the United States. Welcome, Erez.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Delighted to join this great panel.
All right, terrific panel. Spencer, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Bruce. So why don't we jump into it? We're going to run through a couple different questions. I think there might also be some questions from the audience, hopefully. I'll kind of kick it off. So the panelists and I have had a number of conversations to run through what we see go wrong in global incident response and what we see that works. And I just want to spend a little bit of time, before we get into it, setting the stage. So everyone's been involved in a number of incidents, and I think we all agree a global incident or an incident affecting multiple jurisdictions is not just a bigger version of a local incident. What you might do managing a local incident may not scale or be appropriate and might actually just fall apart when you start turning to multiple jurisdictions. It's not just the complexity of the logistics and operations across multiple time zones, though that is a part of it. Some organizations end up burning people out. Some organizations don't properly handle the fact that they might have multiple different IT teams or multiple different MSPs involved. There's governance challenges as well, depending on the organization. Some companies might try and replicate a model that they use in the US that's very lawyer-led. Other organizations may use a business-led approach. But all of those different aspects and ways of approaching global incident response can have really serious consequences. And I've kind of barely scratched the surface there on what can go wrong. Or the ways that things can be complex. And they all bring me back to one point, which I think we will talk about, which is that you have to have the right team. With that, maybe though, let's kind of start the discussion. Erez, we talk about challenges with governance and the different ways that you can lead incident response. Do you want to maybe elaborate on some of the issues you've seen and how best to address them?
Sure. So first and foremost, thanks again, everyone, for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I've seen things now kind of both from the government, where I led our cyber team and cyber investigations, then in-house for 7 years, global company dealing with incidents around the world and setting that up, and now here as outside counsel. And one of the most critical elements, and Spencer, you talked about it, is how do we bring these teams together? It's not just a bigger version. And the reason is because in so many of these aspects, so many of these businesses, the global businesses are not just one main office with branches, but rather these are multinational companies that have different business units, different business heads, different groups. You mentioned IT, but it's not just IT, it's the whole different C-suites around the world, and how they roll in to the holding company or the mothership all affects how the actual response is going to be. So we often say that the right incident response, especially with a crisis level global incident, requires a balance between the command and control structure that you need in order to bring all the pieces together and cooperation. And nothing could be more important in these global incidents. How do we work so that we avoid the problem of one country's business, one business from unit says, oh, we haven't notified regulators, but another one in another part of the world has notified regulators? How do we avoid having one business in, for example, the US say, we need to tell third parties we have obligations and we've got regulatory 72-hour notifications. And in another part, they say, we can't tell them yet. We've got to tell other regulators, very important third parties. We need to make sure that we've escalated to our internal board. And how do you coordinate all of that? And that's why I say it is actually critical to have that balance, command and control versus cooperation, and bringing them all together. Now, for US companies where I think cyber breaches were such a big thing even earlier, and luckily for the rest of the world, I think they hadn't experienced quite the ferocity of them in the past. But they developed a method of having either someone like a chief operating officer or the general counsel ultimately running a crisis team. And one of the reasons for the general counsel to step in, aside from the fact that when we've seen some of these breaches, we've seen headlines in the Wall Street Journal that says general counsel in the hot seat over this breach and that breach, and literally top of the fold headlines. So aside from that is the ability to think through all of these contractual obligations, regulatory obligations, overseeing what the communications team is doing and whether those words could hurt you in a regulatory or litigation aspect. And so helping to coordinate all those different pieces. But ultimately, you got to work alongside a business leader like a COO who can help coordinate the business aspects because there's so much there for response. In other parts of the world, we have seen a change in that. And I know we'll have some of our other panelists talk about how that is. Regardless, I would say legal's role in this can't be overstated because of all those aspects. And I highly recommend that even though in some parts of the world we don't see legal as front and center in the response teams, there is reason for that. And I don't say that as outside counsel. I say that having had the time as in-house counsel and seeing how effective that is. But before, and more important even than saying, okay, well, this is the structure and laying it out in a response plan, I would say it's absolutely critical to have that response plan for the C-suite because they're going to be coordinating all these businesses. This response plan does not look like the 40-page plans that I have been seeing, that people have been putting out. No C-suite is picking up a 40-page plan. I don't care how great that plan is. There is no C-suite that is picking up a 40-page plan or beyond, or 120-page plan. And those can be super detailed with all these great elements. But a C-suite, they need a 10-page plan that's really about coordination. The C-suite needs to know all the different functions, HR, IT, information security, privacy, legal, all the different functions that need to be part of this and how to coordinate those functions together. And then I still say that's worthless because unless you've actually tested that plan with the C-suite, and by that I don't mean just the CISO and the CIO, because a lot of people say, well, we have our C-suite involved, the CISO and the CIO, but the C-suite itself sitting through an exercise. And I'm going to turn it over, but let me just quote one of our regulators who recently came out and said, and I quote, decision makers such as the CEO should not be testing the incident response plan for the first time during a ransomware incident. Right. And frankly, we have seen that is what happens in place. They say, oh, our C-suite had tabletop incidents or tabletop scenarios. They've worked through this. It's not the main people. It's not the same people who'd be running a global crisis and coordinating like coordinating cats and dogs. That's the practice that comes. And that's what in my prior job we were able to do by doing tabletops around the world and bringing them all together to have that coordinated function.
Great, thanks. Erez, one of the things that you hit on there was, the fact that there might be multiple regulators and you need to coordinate the response there. And I think that's a great point. In a local incident, many businesses and small businesses will be lucky and have either 0 or 1 regulator. In a global one, there may be dozens. Keily, maybe if you could, speak to some of your experience in, how do you manage the external engagement that's necessary?
No, thanks very much, Spencer. And I completely agree with what Erez has just been saying there in terms of practice makes perfect in terms of actually dealing with an incident. But how you deal with an incident and how you conceptualize a global incident is so important, right? I think, as indicated earlier on, the US, frankly, is light years ahead by comparison to some of the other jurisdictions that we deal with. And so being based in London, whether it's by time zone or design or accident, we often end up, frankly, right at the very center of global incidents because we straddle different time zones and can help to coordinate that different response. It's so trite to say it, but really every single regulator in every single jurisdiction is different. People look at the GDPR and they often treat the EU as a homogenous block because it's one law. And that's right, the legal requirements there are strictly the same across geographical boundaries, but each regulator is different. The way in which you engage with them is different. The culture is different in each country. And also, frankly, the outcomes are very different in each country as well. And so for truly global organizations, when you're thinking about reporting to multiple regulators, things like the EU one-stop shop principle are incredibly helpful, but that doesn't solve the whole problem, right? So we look at it through a number of different lenses. First of all, you have to understand the legal requirements in all of the countries that are key to your business. So as we all know, that's going to vary across the board, right? We're seeing a huge proliferation of both privacy and cybersecurity laws across the globe. Some of those, and they all have different requirements. People are often using GDPR as a good baseline, and that's right. But, it's really important to understand what are the differences. How does Brazil differ from the GDPR standard? What about Turkey, where there's an incredibly aggressive regulator? How are we dealing with those issues? And understanding in particular the timescales that you're dealing with. So one of the things that we struggle with when we're advising big international clients who have a US headquarter is actually your first notification is likely not going to be in the US because you don't have that 72-hour ticking time bomb going on from a regulatory perspective. But at the same time, you're thinking, well, hold on a second, this is where our center of gravity is, this is where our customers are, this is where our reputation management is. It's really hard to get the balance right in terms of how to report, where to report, and how to cascade that down. The other thing that's really important as well is thinking about actually, what's the enforcement landscape like where you're reporting, right? So it's not just, is there a law in the statute books? There's plenty of places where there are privacy and cybersecurity laws and zero enforcement, frankly. And there's also places where the legal landscape is not that sophisticated, but actually they've got a very aggressive regulator. So really and truly understanding not just the law, but also how likely is it that you're going to get enforced against? How likely is it that you're going to get follow-up? Is a notification going to be held against you? Is information that you provide to the regulator able to be used in a civil litigation context? All of those things are really key elements to help you to understand a global incident as opposed to a local incident. The other thing that happens again and again and again is thinking about dealing with law enforcement in different jurisdictions. Very, very different approaches, it goes without saying. But, when we're dealing as outside counsel, often when we're dealing with law enforcement in sensitive jurisdictions, in particular the UK and the US, we can be a bit careful about what we choose to disclose, right? We know what our obligations are and we'll obviously comply with those. Where it's optional, we may choose to, for the company's benefit, advise actually to withhold information or to share it at a later date. That just doesn't fly in some other jurisdictions where there is generally a much more cooperative approach to dealing with regulators and law enforcement. Information sharing is typically voluntary, but also interestingly, you're often dealing with non-specialist law enforcement units. This might be their first time dealing with a ransomware incident. That's very different from dealing with the NCSC in the UK or dealing with the FBI in the US. The level of sophistication will often dictate, frankly, how the company responds to law enforcement requests, and will also dictate the actual actionability of those requests, because sometimes we get requests from law enforcement in less sophisticated jurisdictions, which frankly will not really aid their investigation or cannot be done. And trying to explain that to a non-technical person sometimes without sounding like you're being obstructive or difficult can be tricky. And that's where it really, really helps to have great local counsel involved. In saying that, you always need a quarterback, right? steal the American sports analogies here because I can't think of a good one for European or UK sports. But essentially, you need somebody to be like, okay, this is the playbook. This is how we do things. We follow this plan, not a 40-page plan. 40-page plans are lovely, but they should sit in the back. They should be read by people like me and Erez and the general counsel. But C-suite, no one's going to have time. So being practical about thinking what that looks like and making sure that your council truly understand the organization's kind of mission, vision, and values on a global basis. So all your comms chimes with that. You understand their risk appetite and you're helping to triage that across the globe. That for me is the key. And you can't do that without prep. So global red team, kind of a must, frankly. And not only that, but people used to say in the past, right, we've all heard this, oh, that's too difficult. We can't coordinate diaries. It's too hard. How are we going to do it? Guys, we've been working remotely and across geographical areas for the last 2 years very successfully. That excuse doesn't cut it anymore. So we can all choose to do that. And frankly, it's what we all should be doing. That's just my take on it.
Great. Thanks, Keily. I wanted to take two things that you commented on, that kind of how you put it in practice, and you were talking about it in the context of regulator notification, but the different time zones at play, and maybe go to Stuart to talk a little bit about, how does that actually play out? When you look at time zones, coordinating the team, and put things into practice.
Yeah. So this is, in the heat of, I suppose, the incident, a lot of this kind of comes on very quickly. I think ransomware cases have brought this to the forefront because they make themselves evident. I think the other types of cases, which we can talk about, are things that bring it more slowly on. So, having practiced this is immensely important because, if you are learning this if you're a C-suite bringing on during an incident, and this is your first time, it's going to be very painful. We deal with larger and larger companies today than we've ever dealt with before. Probably just they've recognized that there's a few companies out there that can help, and we get the phone calls. And it does often play out that, they have a region, maybe in the US, they have more resources and people there, and they've less in Europe. So really bringing the teams together is invaluable. Okay, so yes, we have Teams, Microsoft Teams, we've got Slack, we've got the tooling. That's not an issue. Now, where that data is kept let's put that aside. What sensitive information is stored on those. But for the argument here of communications, really, we're talking about the technology that's there. Now, one problem we do see is in a major incident, or an MI, I suppose, is as it's detailed in the incident response plan, the 40-page one, Erez. So that one is all hands on deck. Now, one of the problems we do sometimes see is there's probably a bit too many people brought into that. I suppose the incident is garnering the need to have so many people, but not everyone is providing any value. There's too much people on the call and no one is really getting the delegation they're needing. So that's really where the preparedness comes into play, where people understand their roles and responsibilities in an incident. Another thing we see as well is because everybody's being brought on, which obviously it's great that we have access to resources, but this can often lead to burnout. So we often see in a major incident in the region that it's most affecting. So for instance, maybe it's a global company, but it's most affecting Germany. Well, the local German team will be kind of on all the time. And that person maybe is just, the people, one or two people are constantly being asked to do, can you do this with your Active Directory? Can you do this? Can you list me these files? And those people get burnt out very quick. And that's just a consequence of not being used to delegating. And you don't know who else to delegate to, because this is kind of one of your big first instances. And this person is good and you keep kind of relying on them. So sometimes CrowdStrike has to stop and get one of the senior team, pull them aside and kind of say, look, John Doe, Jane Doe is being asked to do too many tasks. We need to kind of push the delegation here, here, and here. It'll free up resources. And this is really going to help us mitigate this incident. And the client might say, yeah, I understand this, and so on. So resources in that kind of global incident is very important. Tabletops often demonstrate that a global company, $1 billion revenue is probably the best kind of way of kind of earmarking that, will often come on the call and say, I'm good in the US, I'm okay in Europe, very light in APAC. That's quite common, right? You could even say the technology adoption looks like that, resourcing looks like that. So that is a kind of an interesting one then if we start to think about where key applications are, key systems, if that kind of sits in APAC, and sorry for all the acronyms, that's Asia Pacific and various parts over there kind of. Then we have a lot of questions on, do we have any resources there that can help? So those are kind of some of the factors that come in. And as Erez said, in the preparedness, you're going to spot this. And the last point I'll say on that is the best thing about preparedness tabletops is, and it doesn't matter if they get heated or people are confused, and that's good. You want people to identify it then, not on the real day, because executives come in with very large sweeping statements, large, big questions. They come on the call like a CFO might come on a call and say, how much is this all going to cost? Or CEO is like, why can't we get all this done by tomorrow? Why can't we bring on those 1,000 servers by tomorrow? These are big questions. The technical team know in that moment that there's a large set of dependencies and risks, but this is what the C-suite come in. They ask big questions. And if they're not used to in a tabletop being kind of having drilled what they can and what they can't get in terms of in reasonable time, that really puts them in situations where they get frustrated because they're presented with lots of technical folks who are great at forensics and then if they're lucky, they've got people kind of like, the Spencers and others who've been at the kind of translating layer. But if they haven't practiced that, they'll ask these questions, they won't get a good response, they get very frustrated. And then it's kind of, for them, they're willing to throw big resources against big problems, but they want kind of maybe too much in a kind of timely manner that, affects the way that business is expecting the incident to get to a mitigation stage. So that's kind of, when we think of resources in a global situation, those are some of the factors we try and help customers think about where you've the least, how do we protect those? How do we make sure we've tested this, prepared?
Hey, Spencer, can I pick up a couple threads there?
Yeah, go for it.
Look, the burnout question and that coordination, I think, and I know that we got a question about follow the sun. I think companies sometimes have a tendency to say, let's get everyone in the room. Stuart was saying that. And when you're managing a global incident, there need to be separate work streams and separate teams. So you're going to have a technical phone call, and that's going to be to organize some of those people who are reading the 40-page plan and are working through some of the technical elements. And that is one phone call, and that's for that technical team. That team might have a readout that'll go to a overall call that's meant for a very small group of people, not the whole world, right? Representatives from around the world, but expression-wise, not everyone has to be in there. And that call is to inform the C-suite. Now, you have a global incident with businesses around the world. You need to have a business level call in each of these regions. That business unit is figuring out how they are managing the incident within their business, and they have a report out up to the major C-suite of the head of the holding company or the corporate head. These series of meetings have to happen, especially in the crisis part, the first couple of weeks, on a regular basis. And then you have coordination through them. Also, there needs to be a lot of structure around these because everyone becomes a cyber and investigations expert all of a sudden when there's an incident. Everybody thinks that they know how to investigate a breach better than your team or your team, Spencer and Stuart. And those who have done this before know that everyone else is wrong and you guys know what you're doing. And frankly, it's our job to shield the incident response teams from endless questions that are just going to slow everything down. Did you go run down this aspect? Well, that's a great point, but that should be done in 2 days because there are more sophisticated points to think about. Did you run down this? Did you do this part? All very great. No one's wrong with these questions, but there is a priority and you guys are working through those. When I was in-house, I felt that my role, because I also led our incident response team, not just our legal team, I felt my role was to shield the IR team and allow them to get their work done. Questions that came in, I didn't always pass those on. I said, okay, hold on, I know what they're working on. And I think that that's the role of that coordinator, is to make sure that there's one constant strand throughout all of these coordination calls, but to have separate coordination calls. And then you build that follow the sun. And those first 2, 3, 4 weeks, they're 24/7, right? And that's why everyone on this phone call who's talking about managing global incidents has teams around the world. And I'll tell you, on my second week here, we worked on an incident where it was follow the sun. Asia was working, and Europe got in, we got in the US, and then, Asia went to sleep. Eventually, UK got to go to sleep. We worked the whole day, and 24/7. I know everyone here has that same kind of team. That's what's necessary, and then you coordinate across the different teams. But I think that's the coordination we're talking about, and you got to have structure around that.
So go ahead, Stuart.
Nope, you go.
I was going to say, and the other thing you need as well is you need to know who makes the decision, right? Who's the final person who goes, yeah, having a tussle between actually we want to do this, we don't want to do this. Who makes the call, right? And why? And so often you see that clear decision-making structure is just not there, especially when you have got disparate business units in different geographies with different aims and different stakeholders. Sorry, Stuart, you.
No, that's a really good point. And just kind of jumping back to work streams. So this is so important because, at a minimum, you have to have 2 work streams. I did actually have an incident, a global incident with a global retail company where another provider was creating 7 work streams, and I just couldn't figure out what were we trying to do with all those work streams. I think they were going off a kind of a template or something, but it frustrated me because we were so micro segmented that someone would be on a remediation work stream, and someone would ask a question and they'd be like, oh no, you need to wait for the deployment work stream. And people were like, okay, do I lose a day because of that? And I think at a minimum 2 is needed. So there's a management work stream and a technical work stream. And as Erez said, this is, management executives don't want to be on calls talking about, I found a file in a directory, it's called 1.exe. They're just not interested, right? So they need to come on, have an opportunity to get these updates as we were talking about. They need to have these kind of ability to ask very difficult questions, right? Things that, the legal resources are there to kind of help with in terms of the decisions about regulators, things that ultimately are going to affect potentially consequences down the road, right? Now, the technical team are trying to make sure that we understand where all the ones and zeros are so that when we create a plan to remove the bad guy, that works, right? So those are why those 2 work streams are there. One is in containment, that's the technical people. And then the executives and the kind of legal and the PR, they're all in here in a different type of containment, but they're trying to prevent longer consequences. Like if you were a large company that provided financial services, but you were the supply chain to 5 banks and you went offline, you're going to have 5 banks ringing you every 30 minutes saying, when are you back? What's your statement? What's going on? And you don't want to be discussing that in a technical work stream, right? When you're talking about files and bits and bytes, you're in a call talking about, what statement we're going to use. And then when the executives have maybe 1 or 2 specific questions, they then look for the bridge to the technical work stream to say, right, when are we contained? Because we want to pull the trigger here on opening up the finance application and let this resume business. And as long as that bridge happens, and I think there's people on this call who've effectively navigated that bridge, then you can get the right piece of data, get the informed decision, and then kind of remediation happens in a timely manner. And it's that disconnect that often causes an issue. And to kind of Keely's point, global companies often will have a CIO and a CISO. I suppose those that haven't maybe gone there yet, the CIO is going to be taking the decisions, right? And he or she is maybe just doesn't have that background in the information security and the practices because their world is around, IT and applications and transformations. So those maybe are things they have to kind of call in somebody and try and learn during the incident of some of the recommendations maybe that the CISO would or should have had at that point. But yeah, in major cases, who makes the decision is key. And you'll see that unfold between the kind of CIO, CISO in some of those bigger cases, especially ransomware, which is a word we've just used, because the CIO wants their applications back up and running, and the CISO wants them brought up safely. And those two statements don't always meet at the same time. So we got to figure out, can we bring this back up tomorrow? And if not, why not? And who here is helping me figure out how I can bring this up safely? So.
One thing I wanted to go to, and we've had a couple of questions in the chat on teams, and building off a point that Erez you made on making sure that you're bringing in, an experienced incident responder to actually do the incident response, and I appreciate that. And I want to talk about it a little with the group. I've been involved in global incident response cases where, everyone also thinks that they're a legal expert, and maybe a client brings in, the corporate firm that they know well because they just did an M&A with them, and hires someone who's not an experienced cyber or data privacy lawyer. And I find myself on the call having to say, like, guys, aren't there also regulatory notifications that we should be talking about? And things like that. So, that's another important team member, from my point of view. But maybe for the group, could we just quickly run through for everyone, who you see on the teams that are coming in? And if no one wants to jump in, maybe I'll turn to Keily first.
Sure. Well, I think, we one of the things, I completely agree with you, Spencer. It's interesting. We sometimes end up being called in to unpick some of those incidents where perhaps it's been a really great trusted M&A counsel who's given the initial call or the initial advice, but ultimately it's recognized that hammer always sees nails, right? So it's important to make sure that you get the right people for the job, whether that's on the IR side or the legal side. Then the other the people that we really need in the room are great PR and comms people. What we do is fundamentally about limiting and mitigating risk. And that matters in terms of how our stakeholders see us, not just our customers and our consumers, but also how we communicate with our regulators. And actually, that's something that we at Orrick, we love one person who we use so much at a PR firm. We basically brought them in-house to do our crisis comms. So we were like, this is just a missing piece of the puzzle that we want to be able to give to our clients. And, I can draft as good as the next lawyer, right? But I'm not a PR expert. So it's nice to bring, recognizing the expertise that they bring and how they help our clients quickly and in real time is huge. So yeah, I think comms are people we absolutely need to have in the room as well.
Spencer, let me add and let me bring out my blunt side. We all know a lot of these teams that we need to bring in. It needs to be good IR teams. It needs to be good lawyers. It needs to be good PR. Those are I think the top three, and then a good ransomware negotiator, probably the top four outside vendors you need to bring in when you're dealing with things. Everyone realizes that cyber is hot and it's a huge moneymaker. And so everyone puts on their website that they know how to do cyber breaches and cyber response. And so, and frankly, that happens in the legal world. And I don't want to disparage anyone, but not everyone is a cyber expert and knows that, even if it says so on their website. But let me use your field, right? Spencer and Stuart, your firms are clearly among the top handful in the world. No question about it. I do get frustrated when companies say to me, I know who we're going to bring in. It's this awesome cyber group. And I look at their website of the cyber group, and it's their IT firm. And they've got really splashy cybersecurity pages on their IT section, but they are an IT firm. Or maybe they're an information security firm that sets up information security. I often use the very simple analysis. Hey, you're setting up a fence in your backyard. When that fence is breached, do you call the fence company or do you call the police and say, someone broke into my backyard? And those are two very different skill sets. And the same is true with incident response and information security. It's two very different skill sets. So companies should not be bringing in their IT vendors or even their information security set up the shop vendors to do the incident response. What you get is lack of preservation, mistakes about privilege and how to handle that, how to work with the companies, with the lawyers and preserve that privilege. You get people saying, oh, wow, this is a big issue. This is a big gap. The company should have done this. Things that your firms, Spencer and Stuart, would not do because you've got experience in this. but other firms are going to put that in writing, and all of a sudden you've got one of the worst documents for your regulatory action talking about, whoa, they messed this up big time. Luckily we're here. Well, luckily you just screwed everything up for the company. So it's really critical to have people who've been through this. Same goes on the PR side. We've worked on breaches. They brought in a PR firm that has not had experience in cyber matters. That PR firm said they were awesome. They get fired a few days later. Now you're a few days behind the ball and working literally around the clock with a new PR firm and a PR work stream. So I think finding the teams that know how to do this and actually specialize in this is really critical.
Yeah. My experience has showed that in the US, they're probably a little bit more used to kind of saying, let's get the best in here. We have a price tag, but this is going to overall reduce the cost and impact of this. I think in Europe, I get a little bit more, we've got a local provider here in France. We're gonna use them, and they're also signed up with us. They're on our system, so it's easy for me to do this. I don't have to sign a new contract, and I can just start today. But you're absolutely right. That provider will come in. CrowdStrike's very good at estimating the level of effort because we do this so much. So when a client says, what's the estimate? We'll say this, this, and this. And they kind of say, well, that seems like an interestingly large sum of money. What they do then is they have a local provider who says, well, this is our daily rate and we're not too sure how much it'll overall cost, but you know us, you work with us, and we'll make sure this is relatively inexpensive. And the issue there is what they probably needed, and especially working with outside counsel, because outside counsel are demanding for a good reason. They want to know what was the exfiltration, where else could the exfiltration of data happen? Not just, it's on that system, but how did it occur? And, they're not interested in, kind of the ones and zeros. They want to know what was the method here, what was the data, and where else could this occur? Now, if you're in a global company, and you picked a local team to support you, and you're in an environment that you have to then try and answer that question, you have to make compromises. And that then is something where you're still there 6 months later, kind of doing box forensics one by one, doing a breadcrumb trail of finding where this bad guy actually went, versus what could have been kind of a 2-week engagement with teams that knew, I have to make the right decisions at the beginning, and I'm not going to learn my way through this. So I very much agree with the statements. And in Europe, we have that kind of little bit way to go. But, thankfully, we do see some advances in that today. But it is very frustrating when you see an incident that could have been mitigated maybe in 2-3 weeks, kind of going on 3 months. Unfortunately, we've seen a few of those in the news. Other reasons why that occurred, but that is that's a big impact to a company. It can last for years and kind of leave marks on them for some time as a business.
One thing I wanted to there was a couple comments in there, and I'll try and weave them together around, letting IT companies, kind of run the incident response and how that can go. And one of the challenges I've seen is that sometimes you end up, particularly in global incidents, where each country has their own MSP that's running the infrastructure, and you end up with different MSPs making different calls as to what the priorities can be, which then presents a challenge on tracking the narrative. But maybe a discussion point for the group on managing priorities. And tracking the output from them, particularly bearing in mind the global nature and the disparate teams. Do we have guidance for everyone attending on, what some of the best ways to manage the different and conflicting priorities and the output from the different work streams?
Yes, I guess if we're taking this in the context of managed service providers, usually your managed service provider might be managing, let's say, a small percentage of the environment. And this really is what's the circumstance here? The circumstance might be they manage 15% of my environment, or they manage 40 or 85. A company that's at 85 or close to kind of full saturation, full outsourcing, probably some large, mega company that they've outsourced to. Now, the big consequences when we're brought in CrowdStrike, first question I'm thinking is, what role does the MSP play? Do they manage the entire application stack? Do they manage just to the operating system, or do they just manage, certain parts of the network, but not to a system level? So establishing that very quickly is needed, because then the roles and responsibilities are going to become pretty quick, and the subject matter experts identifying them is going to become very easy. Another question I might ask as a very independent company is, what occurs if the MSP was at the root, basically at the source of this? Like if the compromise occurred through there, and then that kind of flowed into the company, which unfortunately is and can happen, because you've provided access to another company to 20, 40, or 80% of your environment. So if somebody's accessing their environment and coming through, and that third-party supply chain is and has become evident over the last 18 months as a key business risk. So in those cases, really, if I establish quickly the scope of the MSP's remit and kind of coverage, I'm going to present that as either a risk or a non-risk to the customer that I'm actually working with, in terms of like, does this mean it's going to take me longer to get data I need and access to systems? What if the accounts are related to that MSP that were misused? What does that mean for the roles and responsibilities? And do we have to separate them out of the conversation if that becomes apparent, right? Because CrowdStrike's job is to understand the scope of an incident. We can't have anyone then that suddenly says, well, I'm also managing this network, but I've just found out that this was an account, and we'd like to understand this maybe separately. So we do sometimes see MSPs start running their own investigations while a client has their going, and that can't be good if the goal here is one view and get to a timely remediation if there's multiple investigations being run. And I have been part of that, and that is a reality of this world because people have different interests. So that's a kind of a key factor. And the takeaway I would say from that, and I probably reiterate this near the end, would be I am yet to see good language in a contract that a company signs with an MSP that protects them. I've been on the other side where I've worked for the company that was the MSP, and I've seen these contracts, and it's an extremely loose thing. And I think the world of kind of what Keily and the background of Erez and those is, it's so important that the definition of an incident and the definition of the responsibilities be articulated in those contracts to say, what is a security incident? And whose responsibility is this? And unfortunately, I've been left there where a company says, I don't really know, Stuart, let's just get on with it, which is another way of saying, we'll kind of figure this out later. And that's probably the kind of consequence. So those are some of the things that we've seen affecting when the MSP saturation is high.
And Stuart, you mentioned you might want to come back to something at the end, and I'm afraid, looking at the time, that we're getting pretty close to that. So wanted to, go to some of the other panelists. If you one piece of advice that you could leave the attendees with, what would that be? Maybe start with Keily, just because you're next on my screen here.
Oh, I hate always having to pick one. It's like picking your favorite child. Which sometimes happens, let's be clear. But it's, I think for me, and this is, being a stickler for the documentation, I love a running live timeline of findings and key decisions, how they were made, and what were the risk calls that we take. You'll be amazed at the pace at which our regulators move, that sometimes it's 2-3 years before you're actually getting into the nitty gritty of having a debate about judgment calls that were made, and people's memories are imperfect. So I would encourage that from the get-go. And trust me, it's been a lifesaver for me on a number of occasions. And the amount of organizations have gone, oh, thank God we had that, is one of those things. So it pays dividends.
And Erez, for you?
Yeah, we talked about identifying people. One thing we've worked with clients is creating a racy chart. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who do you consult, and who do you inform? And if you do that, both on a central basis, but then say, well, how does that relate to incidents that are occurring in one part of the world or around the world? And you break that out. Now it's clear. When you have a central person running the incident and actually saying, let's stick with what we decided as to who's responsible for these, it creates a better global incident, better run global incident. So thinking about racy charts to really identify the players and then sticking with that.
And Stuart?
Yeah, just in your vendor management program, ask legal, is there language in contracts that helps us better understand responsibilities and definitions of incidents? If it's not there, can we revise it? And just use that to kind of better strengthen cooperation if you have that type of a setup with multiple MSPs.
And for me, it's a comment that was made earlier by pretty much everyone, and make sure that you know what you're going to do ahead of time. Think through who you're going to bring in, who's going to be on your team, and that you're able to do that. Otherwise you'll be doing this for the first time in real time during an incident. That's a disaster in the making. But I know we're coming up to time, so Bruce, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Spencer. Terrific job moderating and great job by the panel. Great topic. We really appreciate it. The next panel will be on cyber attacks on the supply chain, incident response strategies. That'll start at 2:40. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you.